Thank you for joining us today. My name's Dr. Addy Adelaine. I'll be hosting this meeting today. I think most of you probably know us from Twitter, and in the background we have a number of individuals here. So today we've got myself in the conversation. Dr. Michelle King-Okoye is going to be a co-facilitator. We've got several panelists for you. So Dr. Hannah Robbins, Dr. Jason Arday, Dr. Erinma Ochu, and Dr. Arun Verma. It's also important to note that there's been a number of incredible women that have actually been working in the background to actually facilitate this work. Some of them have chosen not to disclose their identity today. So I want to acknowledge their contribution, but I won't be naming them specifically at the moment. Okay, we're just getting started at the moment, but our aims today is to discuss the issue of knowledge equity, and particularly the experiences of Black academics, minority scholars, and the contributions they make in HE and research, but also their challenges, the barriers that they face. Many of you joined today because we also will be looking at what happened with UKRI, and also because we want to discuss what we do next and how we work together collaboratively. After that, we'll go to the panelists for their introductions and an initial response to what they've heard, and there should be a chance for a couple of quick questions. Okay, after the panel discussion, the questions and answers, we'll talk about how we take collaborative action forwards. Let's start off by talking about my own research experience. So I identify as a woman, I identify as mixed heritage and Black. I'm second generation Windrush. So my father actually came over in 1957 as part of the Windrush migration from Jamaica. I was brought up in a working class area from a low socioeconomic background. And I was the first of my family, first of anybody that I knew to go to university. I also identify as neurodivergent and dyslexic, but I also recognise that I have privileges in many different ways. I'm light-skinned, I'm British, I'm native English speaking, heterosexual, and I'm not a minority, what's regarded as a minority faith in the UK. I did a bachelor's degree in disaster management and engineering. So that was in 1999 I came in, and I was I was one of very few females, and I was the only Black individual on that course. After that, I actually became a disaster manager and actually worked in South Africa during the 2004 Southern African food crisis. When I saw the response, I recognised that there was a lack of accountability. So people who are most affected by the issue were not actually involved in the design, monitoring and evaluation, or in the research that was taking place in the context. And that grew an interest in me into going into and exploring accountability, and led me to do my PhD. Okay, so my academic training, I should say I got a Master's of Research Methods, a PhD in International Social Work. I was also an ESRC 3+1 student, and as that will be highlighted later on, that was something that was more unique than I actually realised at the time. My PhD's on the subject of organisational accountability, and I look at power and inequality in research. Don't expect you to read through all of these slides. I'm not expecting the full details to be highlighted, but what I'm actually going through is my own experience, and it will be highlighted why that's relevant later on. My experience, I went from disaster management and engineering to looking at accountability and excluded voices, marginalised voices. And in my PhD, I wanted to look at why it was important to listen and why it was important to involve individuals in the research experience. When I came back from doing my field work, my positionality changed. And actually, I found the final year of doing my PhD really difficult and exceptionally challenging. Now, I was funded for 4 years doing my PhD, but it actually took me 5 years. to complete. So for that final year, I accrued a massive amount of debt. I was working almost full-time on top of completing my PhD, and I was unable to attend things like conferences and network events. Quite often I would apply for additional funding, but it was never deemed appropriate. I never actually was successful in attaining any additional funding. One of the reasons why I mentioned that is because the experience of being Black in academia, I didn't have anybody else to speak to. I never knew anyone else that went to university. I didn't, only ever in my whole academic career, I had one Black academic that taught me. No Black teachers, and probably only 3 individuals throughout my whole academic career that I ever, individuals that were in my class. So it's a really isolating experience and you don't really know what's what. So I kind of left the PhD experience, and then I actually became homeless because of the debt that I incurred. And I found it incredibly difficult to find my way into those networks and systems where I could find employment. I was actually traveling halfway across the country to do sessional 0-hour teaching in Warwick University, teaching for 3 hours once a week on a part-time contract, and then returning back to Bristol. So in order to get my foot in the door, I felt I had to do that. And it became quite a traumatic event. Eventually, I did go on to working more in a more stable way within academia, but it took a long time. And that time, it had a very detrimental impact upon my career. Okay, so I've talked about my experience a little bit, but as I'm highlighting on this slide, my experience is not unique. There's, sorry about this. From over 19,000 individuals, there's only 35 Black women in higher education. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back. Okay. So that's a 0.0018%. And actually, if you look at the other slide here, we can see from those in full-time employment, so remember Black academics are much more likely to be on 0-hour contracts. There's only 1.3% of individuals on full-time research contracts are Black females. Now, why does that matter? That matters because we are unlikely to be able to reach those positions that will allow us to access research funding. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm just going to skip ahead. Okay, so I'm going to move on to how the events with UKRI unfolded. So I was actually overseas at the time that the COVID outbreak happened. So I was asked to come back to the UK, and I returned to the UK into an unstable housing situation, feeling isolated and in fear of my community. I was realising that my previous work for the NHS on inclusion and leadership was significant. As you can see from this slide, we were getting reports in that PPE was harder for some BAME staff members to access, and there was issues of potentially discrimination in the workplace affecting people's access to PPE. So I had this huge desire to help my community and utilise my knowledge in a way that was effective. However, I started to look at these issues and started to try and find out how I could be involved. And then we were hit with the double crisis of the heightened racial tensions and George Floyd's death. Now, there was this emotional trauma of this event, and the event had a particular impact upon Black academics. We feared for our community, but also many of us were finding that we were being asked to do additional work for our universities, being asked to explain our lived experiences and help other white academics understand the importance of race and discrimination in higher education. It's one of the things that led me to write this article on how individuals could ensure that they do no harm when trying to help. Okay. However, after a while, there became some kind of hope, and UKRI was amongst many organisations that made a statement on Black Lives Matter. They made an explicit commitment to addressing inequality, addressing racism, and the systemic issues that mattered. Okay, so at this point, we thought, okay, there's hope. Our community was addressing issues and highlighting issues, for example, within the Public Health England inquiry on COVID and BAME communities. After that report was highlighted, stakeholders expressed their concern, and you can see from this quote here that discrimination and systemic issues was impacting their experience and vulnerability to COVID. So in response to this, UKRI put out this funding call to look at the connection between COVID and BAME communities. Now, I wanted to utilise my experience in disaster management and in working for the NHS, my understanding of race and equality. Okay, so I worked with Dr. Michelle King-Okiye and we developed a proposal for the UKRI call. When the call came out, we actually realised that nobody I knew actually was successful. So I knew numerous Black academics who had made applications, and like myself, no one received any funding. In fact, when I looked at who had been awarded the funds, £0 went to Black academic leads. Okay. We also looked at the type of awards that were given, and there seemed to be a heavy focus on genetics, rather than concerns that were raised by BAME communities in the Public Health England review. Okay, after this happened, I started tweeting and talking about this event. UKR responded in a number of tweets, as this slide shows. So I wouldn't try and read it right now. But in their response, it became clear that no equality data was gathered, that individuals were conflating the idea of Black and BAME, that there didn't seem to be this kind of recognition of involving Black academics in the process. So when we mentioned that there was no Black academic leads funded, quite often the response we were getting was, well, there was community leaders involved, but there wasn't really an appreciation of the power and inequality within that process when issues affecting our community were being led by, well, none of the research was being led by Black academics. We looked at the panelists and realised that there seemed to be little ethnic diversity within the panelists. And by accident, I actually noticed a name on the panelists that UKRI gave me. And I realised that one person who was involved in the assessment, in the panel assessment, was actually connected to three of the 6 studies that were awarded. I responded to UKRI and they confirmed this on Twitter, saying that we had the right panel list and this was correct. I later learned that the same assessor had worked with 6 out of 7 of the recipients of the awards. We also recognised that there were no social enterprises available, awarded any funding, but they all seemed to go to large universities with pre-established connections to UKRI. Okay, so what happened next? When things started to emerge, there was a lot of public interest and I decided to ask for help. So I contacted 10 Black women that I knew who were excellent in this field and asked them for their support. I also contacted UKRI and asked them for a meeting. I made a Freedom of Information request and I made a number of connections behind the scenes. So whilst I chose actively to work with Black female academics, I decided to work in different ways with different individuals. Okay. We then, as a group, wrote the open letter to UKRI, which was highlighted on our website, which gained which highlighted a number of short-term and long-term goals, and which gained nearly 3,000 signatures, celebrity endorsements, and several media coverage. I'm just going to ask at this point for Hannah to engage and maybe to talk to select a couple of questions.
Hi, Addy. Yeah, I'm here. The key question that's come through is how many people were on the deciding panel you're talking about, that panelist that was associated with a number of the bids? And there's just a question about clarity about how many other people were involved in the decision-making process.
So I'm just going to switch my camera for 1 second while I answer this, but I'll carry on talking. So on the panelist, it looked like there was approximately 30 individuals involved in that. And that list was made available by UKRI. It's publicly available and will be made available late after this event.
The only other thing was just a comment really about the tone of the responses in the Twitter discussion, the sort of...
Yeah, the tone was interesting. Sorry, I'm back again now. The tone was interesting because it felt like UKRI, they were being very transparent, and we never actually said that UKRI had done anything illegal or irresponsible. It's trying to make clear that the systems and processes for us seemed problematic. So we weren't accusing specific individuals of doing anything wrong, but what we actually were trying to highlight was that there seemed to be a problem in these systems and processes. UKRI responded and highlighted that actually they were following their systems and processes. So I think there was a little bit of disjuncture on actually what was happening. Okay, so talk about what happened next. And I think many of you were aware that, oh, sorry. I think many of you are aware that we were trying to highlight that we wanted a meeting on the 8th, which didn't take place. Hannah, can you just enable or pass the hosting back to me so I can share the screen again, please? And I'll go back to those questions. So on the 8th, we were due to have this meeting, which didn't take place. And I think one of the things that we realised was that many individuals were afraid of actually speaking openly about this. You've got to remember the power that UKRI has in this process and the kind of concerns of many individuals that were taking place. So we were meant to meet this meeting, but just 15 minutes before, we actually had to cancel that because our safeguarding concerns weren't addressed. Now, I've been very much dealing with UKRI and their response in this. Dr. Michelle, who actually wrote the proposal with me, has actually gone on to do unfunded work and continue her research unfunded. So it shows the different routes that different academics have gone through. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the issues of concern before we move on to some questions. So the process that we saw within the funding, it seemed to be this kind of closed loop process where all of the individuals knew each other. And if you recall back to me describing my experience as an academic, I think one of the things that affect Black academics is the lack of access to networks and kind of conferences and there's this kind of closed loop, it feels like, of individuals that are involved. We also were a bit concerned over the potential conflict of interest with one of the individuals being on the assessment panel, although it was made clear that they did leave the room during the assessment. But then being on the panel and judging the other research applications, whilst also being a co-investigator of 3 of the 6 awards. So we looked at UKRI's conflict of interest policy, and it said that we must be vigilant about, it says that UKRI must be vigilant about the risk of have appropriate policies and plans in place against conflict of interest. But it actually says that there's no reason to believe that conflict of interest should undermine decision-making. Okay, so that might be a bit of a problematic issue. We're also concerned over the diversity of thought. So when we look at the panelists, there seem to be very few individuals with a background in race and ethnicity. That very few of the people assessing the awards came from that background. Predominantly, many of them came from health, and many of them had no background in understanding the complexity or the social dimensions of health when it came to COVID and ethnicity. So we want to ask UKRI more about these issues. We've only got very basic information that's been made available. So most of these points are more questions than really statements or accusations in any way, shape or form. We also wanted to talk about UKRI's own internal processes and what's the breakup of their staff, who's making the decisions within UKRI. Now, we looked at their 2020 report and it breaks down, you can see gender and position. When it comes to ethnicity, BME is put together in one bracket. And you can see from this that only 7% of UKRI staff identify as BME. So the B within BME, Black individuals, we don't actually know what kind of percentage of staff are Black within UKRI or how this impacts upon how they regard race and ethnicity within this organisation. There's an external advisory group within UKRI. We understand that, and it appears that UKRI is actually doing a lot of work on the issue of race and ethnicity. But we don't actually know the details of the advisory group. So do they actually have any power to change and influence to make those decisions? So there's a difference between representation and power in decision making. Okay, when it comes to safeguarding, this was the issue that prevented us from meeting on the 8th, and we are very curious to speak to UKRI about how they safeguard Black academics who want to raise issues and how they safeguard their staff members who want to also raise issues. UKRI is developing a strategy. It appears we need to know more. We would like to know more about this. So they're looking at equality, diversity and inclusion. And you can see a couple of the reports that are being made clear here. So we know that they're doing work. We know that they're reviewing the process, but who is leading that process? Who decides that this is the correct process? What's their background? From what we can see on some of these reports, they don't seem to be led by individuals with a particular specialism in race and ethnicity. I also can't see if there's been any opportunity for Black academics to feed into the review process or the development of an ED&I strategy. Once again, I just don't know how you can engage with UKRI on these issues. We've got some immediate concerns when it comes to upcoming funding calls. So we know that in the very near future, there will be another COVID and BAME funding call. We know that there will also be a funding call relating to supporting diversity in research and academia. We also have this concern that there might be a second wave on its way of COVID. So the research we need research that is going to address the immediate concerns of our community. And we need research that is going to address the questions that we want to ask. So in the Public Health England report, it appears that our questions have not yet been answered. There's also kind of tangential issues of inquiries that are ongoing, job losses and hostility faced by Black academics at this particular point in time. So again, how are these issues going to be addressed? Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there for the moment and pass back to Hannah for a couple of questions.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of things come in. A great one here. So do you feel that the focus in awarding studies, focusing on genetic issues rather than socioeconomic factors, is an indicator of the level of resistance there is to accept inequality is caused by racism rather than race?
I think that's really important, and I think it's particularly important at this time. So we've seen in America how race scholars and individuals looking at critical race theory have been targeted recently and the hostility that they're facing. Now, there's different ways to look at race and ethnicity, and we're not denying that other people have valid ways and that we need to consider things like genetics and predispositions to certain health conditions. But UKRI covers a wide range of research councils and a wide range of researchers and disciplines and thoughts. So what we're saying is that there has to be some kind of accountable and transparent system for ensuring that we have a wide range of views and a wide range of thoughts. We're not trying to monopolise the discussion, but we need to make sure that certain individuals aren't marginalised within the discussion.
And I think, kind of feeding on from what you've just said, that we had a question about sort of positionality and why you had picked your stance to sort of foreground disparities that Black and other ethnic minority groups experience in direct relation to this failure to fund Black academic research.
Okay. So the issue that emerged on this occasion, so specifically impacted upon Black academics. So my interest in this area came from the NIHR and UKRI funding of COVID and ethnicity. That in this call, there were BAME individuals who did receive funding, but what became very clear that there were no individuals from African or Afro-Caribbean heritage that did. And I think we have to start asking whose voices aren't being heard and who is absent from the discussion. So, and I think there's different issues that affect different individuals within education and HE. So we're not saying that people who are LGBT plus or who are disabled or who are white working class aren't experiencing anything. I think there's unique challenges that face individuals who identify as Black. And I think quite often it goes back to stereotypes of intelligence, etc., that they're not actually capable of leading this type of dialogue, of leading research, of leading inquiry into the issues that affect their own lives. So I specifically sought out 10 brilliant Black women to respond to this issue and to respond to the letter, not because nobody else has a right to the conversation or is entitled to engage in the conversation, but because in particular, Black women are marginalised and their voices are marginalised within the dialogue of research and higher education.
Okay, we've got also, do you want to carry on now?
I think what I'll probably do now is I'm just a bit aware of time. So actually, I'm going to pass on to yourself, Hannah, as the first panellist. I'm so sorry I've zoomed through everything so quickly. I had all of my PowerPoints ready, and there's just so much to discuss on this topics, but I think we'll come back to that through the questions. But for now, Hannah, I just wanted you to introduce yourself, what your interest in this area is, and your kind of immediate thoughts and feelings regarding this subject area.
Okay, thanks, Addy. And I want to echo something that's just come up in the chat as well, that's just acknowledging the amount of work that you put in, and also how clear and well-paced this has been. So take a couple of minutes and breathe, because it's going really well. Hello, everybody. I am Hannah Robbins. I am an assistant professor in music. I am also part of the activist scholar collective, I guess you would call it, the Free Black Uni, and a co-curator of the new international network, Black in Arts and Humanities. I am specifically interested in this area. I think it's important to just acknowledge that I am one of few women of Black heritage, or people of Black heritage working in music scholarship in the UK. And for me, I'm particularly interested in the conversation about the pipeline, about this idea that somehow Black researchers get stopped somewhere, and those conversations tend to centre on the PhD process, and we're still not having sufficient conversations about why Black academics are not being represented in permanent posts, are being almost, and we've seen the data already, almost entirely put into temporary contracts. And while that is affecting all academics at the moment, we can see a disproportionate impact on Black and Black heritage individuals in UK academia. So what I'm particularly interested in is where are those inequities really coming to the fore? And from my point of view, it comes back to research funding, and that's actually particularly prominent in the arts and humanities, where there are very few Black academics at any grade in any discipline. and therefore people are not being included as co-Is on bids. They are not being represented in the major research funding outputs that are present. And therefore, when someone is able to identify a point of dialogue dissonance, so a point of collision where the system is not working, like Addy has done in this case with UKRI, I think it's really important to stop and look and react in the moment. And for those of us with relative privilege, I am not a member of that set of statistics because I'm not a full-time member of staff. I am on a part-time contract. But I think it's really important for us to take our privilege and interrupt that process as it's happening, rather than reflect retrospectively, because that is actually how the system continues. A thought in the distance is not going to interrupt this process. So that's a little bit about me and how I'm reacting to what's going on, and also, as you know, a supporter of the people leading this particular work.
Brilliant. Hannah, just before we move on to Jason, I just wanted to ask you, was there anything that, from the events that I described with UKRI, was there anything that particularly shocked you or you wanted to pull out or highlight from the events?
I think there are two things that particularly spoke out to me. One was the manner of communication as Twitter, acknowledging Twitter as a public forum, and the tone of some of the dialogue there, and the sort of you asking very specific questions and then getting responses implying that you didn't understand the question that you had asked, was quite concerning and indicative of a manner of being defensive that people of Black heritage are very familiar with, where you ask a question and someone explains your question back to you because they don't want to answer it. And that was the first thing that struck me. But I also think we have to have a conversation about what safeguarding means for Black academics and what safeguarding means for different intersectional identities, because you had thought through how a useful meeting could take place, and UKRI seemed to have interrupted the possibility of having that conversation. So those are the two things that really struck me, is that they'd had this public reckoning, if you like, and chosen to not engage with it in a suitable way, but then also to ignore the terms of having a meeting about it.
I think for me, one of the reasons why I utilise my title as doctor is that I'm not your stereotypical doctor or academic. And I think people have this real challenge of recognising that I'm a qualified, trained, experienced expert in my field and a community member. And people don't seem to be able to disentangle that. So one of the reasons why I use the title doctor is to highlight that I do have a PhD, that I am qualified. And I think particularly as Black women, we often get accused of being quite aggressive when we try and raise our lived experience. So we're quite often challenged and told that we're kind of troublemakers, or that we're being problematic in raising the concerns that we face. So that's one thing. And then I think also there's been this kind of consistent underestimation of all of the Black individuals that have been involved in this. And I think, again, that goes back to the racial stereotype of Black individuals in particular being non-intellectual, being not able to work at this level. And I think that's very different from East Asian academics or Central Asian academics, etc. I'm not saying that they don't face challenges, but I think that particular stereotype is very typical and very specific to the Black academic experience. So it's really hard to disentangle on a medium like Twitter how much to do with the response is to do with that kind of unconscious bias about who I am and my identity, and what was really meant behind those comments. So I'm really looking forward to UKRI so we can start disentangling some of this complexity. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Jason now. So Dr. Jason Arday, and I just wanted to ask you the same questions. So can you give us a bit of background to yourself and why this interest area interests you, and also your initial thoughts and feelings regarding the issues that emerged.
I hope everyone's keeping well and living right with some luck. So it's just really good to be part of this and be involved. And I suppose the first thing I want to do is just pay tribute to Addy's amazing work and all the women of colour, particularly Black women, that continue to unfairly carry the burden of this work. I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge that. And, you know, it's important that I acknowledge the privilege that I've gained from that. And, you know, I've spent, I think, the best part of the last 5 years since I've been doing this work trying to really level that as best as I can. I recognise that I still have a lot of work to do. So my name is Jason, and I'm really fortunate to be, I guess, part of an amazing swell of Black academics in the UK at the moment, and really just trying to keep a pace with them. And I suppose the most important thing at the moment is that we've kind of reached a really seminal moment, particularly in the UK Academy, in terms of opportunity or the lack of, and we're kind of looking around and thinking what is reflective of, you know, a diverse academy. And I think one of the things that's becoming more apparent, as colleague Hannah's just said, is really the dearth of BAME academics going through. So what we do know is that since 2003, BAME students, specifically Black students, have been going to university in record numbers. But what we still have, the problem is that we don't actually see the end of that in terms of coming through the pipeline. So we have a lot of Black students who are going on to do master's degrees, looking for opportunities to get onto PhDs, and as the kind of statistics show from the brilliant work from Leading Roots, led by the fantastic Paulette Williams and Chantel Lewis and Suki Barth, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So, you know, currently in terms of 2018, 2019, we were still looking at just 1.2% of PhD studentships awarded to Black students, 30 of those being from a Black Caribbean background. And I guess the issue is that we still reside in this idea of what a blueprint is. So, you know, I think the most common question I'm asked is, how did you get to where you got to? And, you know, you never want to throw people off the scent, but what you try and do is tell them what you have to do to get to that point. And interestingly, what there is a blueprint for aspiring young white academics, because the system in many ways is structured to facilitate that. What we don't have is a system that is structured to facilitate aspirational Black endeavour in the academy. And so to give a young Black aspiring person who would like to take their place in the academy a blueprint is almost impossible, because there is no blueprint to have, because the racism that they have to pervade in itself renews itself every other year. You know, it's the instruments that we use to address these problems in some ways remain the same, but the actual kind of structure of racism, it kind of reinvents itself, which makes it really hard to keep abreast of. And so all of this endeavor comes at a cost, and very often it comes at the cost of, in terms of the labor of this work, Black women, and it obviously comes at the cost of not having that broad breadth of talented Black academics that we could quite easily have if we engaged in a process that was egalitarian and engaged with equity. And I suppose my interest in terms of what Addy's done, which I just think is brilliant, is really kind of, I'm not on social media, and I think if most people don't know, I will say it now, I hate social media with passion. So I've never been on it, and I never will be on it. So actually a lot of the stuff that UKRI have said, I don't know. But what I found it through kind of secondary information, and Addy's actually told me, and it was the kind of responses that you expect. You expect them to kind of roll out the company lines, but I think the most important thing is that the figures don't lie. And if you're awarding, you know, in 2018, 2019, nearly 20,000 studentships, and 1.2% go to Black students, UKRI are the head of that, oversee those research councils. We have a problem. And I think it's really important that when engaging in these discourses, we reside with the facts, because I think too often Black people engage in this work are palmed off as being emotional or aggressive or, you know, hypersensitive, but actually the facts themselves show the disparity and that in itself speaks volumes. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. And I guess the most important thing is really thinking about how we nurture or change that culture, and probably equally as important, support people that are already in the academy. Because, you know, if we take Addy's story to be specific, here you have, you know, an extremely talented and gifted academic, in my humble opinion. Not that my opinion should matter, but residing on the periphery of the academy, which is actually quite common for a lot of Black academics. So I think that in itself, we need to think about how, as an academy, because I think, yes, the problem does lay at the door of whiteness, but actually we all have a foot in the academy. So it's thinking about what we can all do to alleviate that privilege and to mobilize in a really positive way. And I'll be the first to make sure that I do that before I point the finger at anyone else.
Thank you. I think it's really important, some of the points that you raised. For a start, often when you have this discussion about being Black in academia or being Black researchers, the response that you get is, well, there just aren't Black academics. And people have said that directly to my face and to the face of other Black academics that have been in the room. And I think, you know, I struggle to recommend academia as a career because it's a really hostile environment, and it has a definite impact on your mental health and well-being, your physical health and well-being, to be a part of this world. And so many of us, and particularly Black women, do obtain PhDs but actually exit academia. There's so many individuals that have entered and achieved this and that have left due to the hostility that they face within this environment. And like you say, I'm on the borders of that. I'm just on the edge of academia, I feel like, at the moment. And I'm not sure how much longer I can survive within academia, much longer I'm going to last. So there's such a waste of brilliant minds and investment in training. So I think quite often when we look at this issue, again, they're talking about building our capacity, about building the capacity of Black academics, about training Black academics, which is an important part of the story. But you can't make that investment and then have nowhere for us to go, for us to find ourselves academically homeless at the end of it, because we can't find permanent employment, because we face systemic and institutional discrimination, and because we're never allowed to lead our own story, be the authors of our own life, and to actually do inquiry upon the issues that we are impacted by. Jason, I just wanted to ask you, was there anything that kind of shocked you or surprised you about what you were hearing?
No, not at all, because I'm not a pessimistic person, nor am I a skeptical person, but I think I'd be more surprised if the figures were favourable, because like, I just think that that's what it is, right? And sadly, you come to, I wouldn't say accept that, you come to understand that is a huge part of it. And you also understand that a lot of your work is centered around trying to make change and really infiltrate policy. And I think within that particular context, you're never really surprised when these figures get illuminated. You kind of think, yeah, that only emphasizes what I already potentially thought. Because if there wasn't the discourse and the figures to support that, then what it would be perceived as is that, it's subjective in conjecture. That's your opinion, Jason or Addy. How do you know that that's fact? But we know what it is. So all we can all really do is collectively try and dismantle that particular structure, not just for the benefit of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, but for all people. It's in everyone's best interests to have a research landscape that is reflective of the multicultural society we live in. So,
Dr. Arun Verma, I just wanted you to respond to the same questions if possible. So to introduce yourself and your interest areas, why you're interested in this subject, and also kind of what's your initial responses to what you've been witnessing and hearing.
Great, thanks, Addy. And thanks again for this space. Just in terms of introducing myself, my name is Arun Verma. I'm I've been in academia and left academia. I've worked in government and the third sector as well. So I've seen race equality issues in different forms in different spaces. Identify as a cisgender male and identify as a queer non-Black person of colour. I do recognise my privileges and struggles and the tensions those face as well. But I feel very grateful to be in this space. So thanks very much for the invitation. In terms of my own personal experience, I've been subjected to and witnessed various forms of intersecting racism and homophobia in my time as an undergraduate, postgraduate, doctorate holder, and an ex-lecturer. And so there's a personal investment in kind of being a part of race equality, and particularly advocating and conspiring with Black women is in the best way I can, in a way that they decide is best as well. So I do recognise, similarly to Jason, the privileges that I have and trying to work hard at being critical of myself in those ways as well. In terms of my interest in knowledge equity, research equality, etc., I'm very much come from a systems perspective. I believe in systemic change. I feel systemic change is sustainable change. And until we have systems like UKRI that recognise that they are perpetuating racism, they're perpetuating covert kinds of racism and explicit kinds of racism, we won't have changes or ripple effect in that area. And I think that's a really, really important part. Research funding is a huge part of the higher education system. And that's something I fully support kind of Addy's and the various other Black women that I've spoken truth to power for this area as well. In terms of my own work that I'm doing at the moment, I'm organising a campaign of anti-racism action guides for the higher education sector, which is led by, it's led by an intersectional approach, and it's exploring and drawing on the experiences of Black and staff and students of colour in higher education to speak out, be heard, and dictate the change that need to be made in higher education institutions authentically and meaningfully as well. And it's essentially, I'm not too interested in repeating the stories that we already know that exist. And so what I've been really advocating for is bringing up the experiences that do exist in the literature, that do exist in media and in history, and just making sure that they have the platform they deserve to have to enact change that need to happen. In terms of some of the barriers that I think are still present, particularly in relation to UKRI, there's a dissonance between superficial and authentic changes. We've seen multiple tokenistic campaigns, but no real effort to take a systems approach to change for these institutions and for the sector more widely. And racism is the barrier to change at this point, and that is the quite simple part of it as well. However, it can often be hidden behind complexity and the overcreation of subcommittees, which is something that we can see quite often, and frustratingly as well, which create more loopholes. In terms of how I think we could work and progress in a collective effort, I fully embrace and try to practice intersectionality as much as possible, taking it out of the academic high levels and bringing it down to reality as much as possible. And I do feel that if we start to shed light and coach individuals into understanding what systemic racism actually is by empowering the voices of others, particularly of Black women in the UK, and I'm focusing on the UK context, then we can actually enact change for a lot of other people as well. And so I'm very big on participatory and collective action. As Addy knows, we've talked and conversed and debated on this as well. I'm very big on constructive disruption. I think that's the key to a lot of this stuff, and I feel like that's what Addy and Black women, as part of this collective effort, have been trying to do, and I think that's fantastic. And I think we need to ripple this disruption into the higher education system because it's stagnated in white privilege and colonialism. And I think that's where we will get to. And I think those nudges will be really powerful. That's my preamble, post-amble, whatever. So thanks very much for that space. You're on mute, Addy.
Sorry, thank you, Arun. That was really good. I'm going to move straight on to Erinma because I think we're running a little bit behind time at the moment, and I want to make sure we've got space for the collective discussion. So Erinma, if you can come on now, please. Hello. So can I ask you the same questions again? So who are you? What's your background or interest in this? And what struck you about the events and what you've kind of heard at the start of this meeting?
So much for organising this, and really wonderful to hear from everybody so far. My name's Erinma Ochu. My pronouns are she, they. I want to thank and acknowledge the Black communities and the Black women who've helped me through the lockdown, who've given me the opportunity to keep going. You know, we've been through a lot together. One of the things that really resonates with me, Addy, with the work that you put together, is that there are some moments that really chime in terms of what you've pointed out. And I think it's really important to look at what the different ways in which Black platforms, Black-led platforms, have successfully made inroads into change. We need to build coalition and make a difference in that space. Black non-academic and Black academic platforms. And I think it's really important to point that out. You know, the Free Black University that sprung up during lockdown, that the moment that all Black people in the UK were hit in seeing many Black people die multiple times on social media under lockdown, and the failure of our white colleagues to understand that. I have to say, I run an anti-racist climate crisis project that's funded by UKRI discipline. And not a single member of my white colleagues were in touch to say, you know, are you all right? How are you doing? But do you know who was in touch? It was our Black community partners. And thank God that we had Black community partners. You know, we've done a lot of work during lockdown, and we've also, you know, I've looked at the letter and I've been challenging. I'm going to be co-chairing a panel very soon. I've tried to implement some of the things that are in your letter already. I've challenged on this data collection at the application stage. That doesn't happen. I can tell you now, it doesn't happen. They only monitor for gender. With another platform, TigerStem, that I'm a member of, I'm on the leadership team of that. You know, thank you to my colleagues from TigerStem in the race group, particularly two postgraduates who we've been in touch through lockdown, and we've supported one another. It astounds me, actually, that we're still here. It absolutely astounds me. What's key to what you've done, Addy, which I really absolutely, you know, I'm so, I don't want to say in awe, because it's emotional labor, it's hard work, but your decision to not go into that meeting and not to take it, absolutely the right decision. And, you know, I want to thank you for that, because under lockdown, I've had to refuse to go to some meetings and to say, you know, to email out to all, I am not coming to another meeting where I'm the only Black academic in the room. And we're talking about building the idea of civic engagement or community engagement. How does that work? That's just about social closure and me trying to explain myself and no one listening. So I've had to refuse, and you know, to see that you've done that, thank you for that. In looking at the figures, the data from UKRI, it's all there to look at now. But I do want to point out the missing data, so everyone can look at the data in their own time. TigerStem have analysed this data from a number of different perspectives. But, you know, in the race group, we've been looking at who's missing from that data, the intersectional perspectives, the disabled perspectives, the granular data is not there. The strategies in which Black academics gain funding is really challenging. Our precarious labour, you know, having to move from one institution to another. I can tell you now, the way that I get funding is I tell other people about my ideas. People get behind them, we get the money. I'm not always the PI. And that'll be a strategy that's used by a lot of people. I would like to point out again, from young people resourcing racial justice, this is an absolutely amazing way in which a resourcing racial justice fund came together under lockdown to fund the people who had been left out. And, you know, there's incredible change making and leadership that's happening in our communities, led by Black women, led from the intersections. I also want to really thank the National Association of Staff for Disability, NASDN. Under lockdown, these are the people who got in touch with me, and we can make things happen. So the intersections, this thinking around this failure to imagine that Black, disabled, Black queer people actually exist. And, you know, I hate to point it out, but there's a study from Wellcome of BME perspectives under COVID, not measuring for disability, not measuring for LGBTQI perspectives. Do we not exist? We do, we're here. And so one of the things that you said, which really resonated with me, Addy, was about how, as a Black academic, my Black community, my partners are reaching out to me, asking me, remember, what can we do? Let's do something. We've got to do something. I was in touch with many of those people who are funded by these funders and other funders to say, look, you're always asking me to come and do diversity stuff for you and talks and speeches and blah, 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 blah. Right now, what I need from you is an investment in the Somali community who have come up with a fantastic proposal under COVID-19 to be able to communicate in ways that are culturally work for them in the way that the government has overlooked them. So, you know, those are the conversations that we were having. We were writing proposals. We could not get them funded, and that's a tragedy.
It's really, sorry, I just wanted to highlight, it's really interesting, your kind of strategy for navigating. So you know, unfortunately, the practical way of us actually surviving in this space is to let other people lead the work. And you said one of the ways you get funding is by allowing white academics to take the lead, apply for the funding, and for you to actually do the work. And I think, you know, we all, as Black academics, we develop these strategies just to survive. And I think, you know, I try to highlight my story because it's hard. It's hard under normal circumstances. And then COVID happened and we saw our communities dying disproportionately, our families affected, our loved ones affected. We then had the George Floyd incident, which again put a spotlight on our lived experience. We were experiencing emotional trauma from that. And we were also, I don't know about anyone else, but I was being consistently asked to explain how I was feeling, to educate white people, and to do it for free. So all of these kind of solidarity statements coming out, and at a time of extreme emotional trauma, you're being asked to do more work for others. And it was piling on and piling on. So throughout this, I was just thinking, I've got knowledge, I've got experience, and I've got research that I want to utilize to help my community. And when that call came out, I really felt like, okay, now's the chance I can contribute. I can utilize my hard fought skills. And it was like another hit to be told, actually, nobody that's Black is going to get a chance to do research on this subject area. And it was like an additional hit. And I think so many people have come forward and asked me how they can help and how they can support this. There's 137 people watching this right now who are trying to learn about our experiences and who actually are demonstrating exceptional allyship right now by allowing Black academics to have a voice and have a space to highlight their concerns, their beliefs, and their experience. But I also wanted to highlight like you were saying, the voices in this space that aren't present. And if you look at the panelists in this meeting, you'll notice that we're BAME, that we're light-skinned people of colour, and that we have, you know, or that we're, in Jason's case, a Black man. There are no dark-skinned Black women available in this conversation. And that's very telling. And that's because whilst I highlight how challenging this has been and how challenging my experience as a Black academic is, I recognise my privilege too, and the certain level of protection that I have by working for a non-profit that does not take funding from UKRI, by being light-skinned, by being British, by being native English speaking with secure nationality. You know, that's all a privilege that allows me to have this difficult, challenging conversation. So whilst it's difficult for me, it's more difficult for others. And I think we need to acknowledge the work and the space that others people bring to this conversation within that. At this point, I'm going to ask the people that are watching to think about themselves, okay? So to think about what you can do moving forward. Part of the reason why I did this was because I'm running out of ideas, because we need to decide how we work together across identities to progress, to make sure that we have more accountable and inclusive research. So if you can, everybody listening, if you've got ideas, thoughts, offers of help, put it into the chat box, okay? If you've got a question for us, we're going to enter the question part of this panel at the moment, and then we're going to go on to our closing remarks and our next actions, okay? So we're going to be watching what's going on. So put your questions in, put your comments in, and I'm actually going to hand over to Dr. Hannah Robbins at the moment to facilitate the last part of this conversation.
Addy, there was just one thing, if it's possible to mention, and that was that my way into this was not through an academic interest in this. It was in a Black community who challenged me to come and speak to them in Moss Side, and they're listening now. Thank you, all power to you. The Blast platform, Blast Fest, challenged me to actually say, Erinma, this is public money. We pay our taxes. How many Black people are funded by, and that put that challenge to me to come and speak to Black people in Moss Side to have that conversation. So there are more than us that are interested in this and why it matters.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful place to sort of segue to the questions. We've had a number of sort of question comments about grappling with these issues at an institutional level. We've got accounts of people being fired for signing campaigns against inequality, and another comment just come in about how do we engage with these biases that are coming from the top down and that we're in the middle. So how do we interrupt that process? So I realize that we're going to come to solutions in a specific sense a little bit later in the conversation, but I wondered if you wanted to speak on anyone wanted to speak specifically about this top down issue that is coming up time and time again.
Okay. I think I'll let somebody else lead on the conversation. I've probably been talking enough.
Perhaps Arun would like to speak on this, given your varied perspectives.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And then thanks for the question. It's hierarchy plays such a pivotal role in higher education and the research landscape. It's very tricky. I'll try my best not to jump into solutions mode. It's quite difficult. It's a human nature thing, right? But the issue is that we currently have a toxic white male leadership across in senior leadership roles. If you look at the landscape of vices and principles, it's not great, and often we see quite superficial jumping on the bandwagon type behaviour, which we've all kind of probably witnessed or heard of through colleagues and peers and stuff in that way as well. One of the issues with this is the acknowledgement. I think there's a fear that senior leadership don't want to acknowledge that they have a race problem, or that they themselves are part of the race problem. I think that when they think that they may have done enough by running small campus-based campaigns and actually shifting accountability to usually students' unions to driving equality and diversity. And also we have an issue in terms of equality and diversity teams, heads and officers who don't often have the power, and something that we picked up on with Addy's work as well, the power to actually facilitate change or nurture change as well. We've also seen a lot of equality diversity committees comprising not of Black females and less so of BAME identifying academics as well. And when you start to look at intersections of that, you see issues as well. There's going to be even less when you start to add the lens of queerness or the queer identity and even disability as probably the most common examples too as well. So in terms of the hierarchy, one of the main issues is really accountability, and accountability at a human level as well as as a professional level. And I think that's where some of the issues are really, really embedded. What I think we're at is we see a lot of that with archaic universities. Polytechnics tend to be slightly different, slightly, not great, but we do see more kind of movement and agility and innovation when it comes to diversity and inclusion in newer modern universities than we do in the ones that are embedded very close to colonialist traditions and knowledge as well. But I'll stop there. So.
I just wanted to comment on a little bit on that. One of the things that I find interesting is this idea of top-down. And I think you're right, there's all these type of different accountabilities. So UKRI is being torn in different directions at the moment. So it is accountable up to the government, it's accountable to kind of parallel organisations, trusts and research foundations. It should be accountable to its own staff members and to Black academics and to all academics. And it should be accountable to the public and the populations. Now, there's a tension between all of those different things, but there's also this kind of assumption that those at the top are white, are privileged, etc. So the focus on upward accountability is not so bad, when actually upward, you have a diversity of opinion. Why is the perception of the accountability to the population and to the so-called communities, there's a certain assumption of who those people are, and there's an assumption of who the people at the top are. Now, what we need to do is break down who at the top is. So look at the diversity of the executives of UKRI, of the board directors, of the trustees, of the decision makers. So actually that, top-down accountability, I'd be happier with it if there was more diversity and representation of who's at the top.
Erinma, I'm going to come to you in 1 second, but I wanted to pick out something that's come up a number of times in both the comments and the questions, which is just to acknowledge that we are, to some extent, describing whiteness as the gatekeeper, the primary gatekeeper here, and I think that is a reasonable point of view, but that we do have to acknowledge that it isn't just white people enforcing these gatekeeping things, and I think that is in part what you are getting at exactly in what you've just said, Addy, about sort of also replicating systems in order to survive. And that's what's so interesting about looking at innovative research models, for example, which are exactly the opposite of what these funding bodies are looking for, where you can't replicate those systems if you don't belong to those communities. So that was just something I wanted to pick out because it's come up a number of times. Erinma, did you want to come in and speak on that?
Yeah, so I would say that, for me, I'm in it for the long haul. I picked this up from my mum and thinking about the 60s, civil rights, black movements, and sometimes it's safer to be in the noise than in the signal. This is something that myself and a couple of wonderful postgraduate physics students thought about in thinking about double consciousness and the different versions of the worlds that are out there. For me, time is it's not linear. I've made some brilliant, I think, inroads into some of the work that I've done with white allies, actually, who now are realizing and coming back and saying, okay, let's do something. And it's taken them 10 years to get to that point. We need to be faster on making those commitments. I reverse mentor heads of school. I reverse mentor deans. I tell them how it is. I've had very powerful one-to-ones. But I've learned how to do these powerful one-to-ones because I've got the backing and the backup of community organisers who've taught me how to do these one-to-ones in a safe way. I've had powerful conversations with the head of HR about the cleaners who are coming in, who are going to be expected to clean our campuses under COVID-19, to challenge them. Why do they not earn a real living wage? And for him to kind of go, oh, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Okay, let's have a follow-up conversation. We're a civic university, are we? I'm not sure. So we really now need to speed this up, absolutely speed it up. Everyone who's there, who's saying they're an ally, there's so much that we can do together. And some of it is small actions. Some of it is very strategic, bigger actions. And actually, some of the people in power, there's a great piece of work by Deborah Gabrielle on allies. And I discovered that actually my biggest allies are white men, white straight men. Never knew that. Didn't get my head around it. Read her paper. I'm like, wow. I found those allies. They've supported me. There've been funders who supported me and enabled me to move away from systemic racism and to continue the work that I do. I'm grateful to them. Of course, they're situated in a particular way. They're not so much under threat, and they have to look like they're doing something. So I think there's a big thing around finding your allies, staying in touch and keeping it going.
Thank you, Erinma. I think that's a really important thing. And just one final area of questioning before I think we want to move on to a discussion of solutions. But I think this is actually a nice gateway to thinking about solutions. Is we've had a number of questions about what the safeguarding model you used for the meeting, Addy, was. But I also thought a question for everybody involved, actually as a stepping stone to thinking about actions, is what kind of safeguarding and protections do we need to put in place? As I said earlier, we're having discussions about people getting fired or facing professional repercussions for speaking up. So what are we looking at in terms of tangible interruptions of that process, and how might that be a gateway perhaps to shaking up the entire structure, as it were? So if I start with Addy, and then we'll move around.
So I'm a social work researcher, so a lot of what I do is about safeguarding difficult conversations or marginalised individuals within certain spaces. So it's quite difficult to highlight and explain to individuals who don't have our lived experience about how dangerous this conversation is for us, about the reality that we face in the workplace by being labelled as angry Black women, by being labelled as troublemakers, etc. And now academics are in precarious employment situations, are actually in quite a risky position at the best of times. So actually speaking out on an issue like this can have a number of impacts with so many different individuals. So it's a difficult conversation to have, and it's something that needs quite a lot of thought and reflection. So when we raised this issue to UKRI, I didn't really want to have to do the work of a multi-billion-pound research organisation for them. I just highlighted that we needed safeguards in place. Now, this issue wasn't addressed until the day before the meeting. And we had a discussion, and they said, you know, about the virtual meeting. So I highlighted that maybe one safeguarding issue would be for the women that wanted to take part to be able to hide their identities, for their identities not to be known by UKRI. We had that discussion, and I was told, have a look into it. If you are comfortable with us hosting, we can do that. But if you want to host yourself, let us know in the morning and we can go with that. So I emailed in the morning saying, actually, I can't guarantee that if UKRI hosts, everyone's going to be safe. So actually, here's an invite. We'll host the meeting and UKRI can join us. Now, we had quite complex and serious safeguarding concerns, which made us want to host the meeting. But UKRI's response was, we can't accept that. This isn't the normal way of doing things. And when I asked why, again, repeatedly, this just isn't the normal way of doing things. Now, I understand this isn't the normal way of doing things, but I also understand this isn't a normal conversation for UKRI, that they don't often engage the most marginalised academics who are dependent upon them and who are dependent upon research funding. So my argument is that UKRI need to actually change the normal way of doing things to make things inclusive and accessible. They asked me to have another meeting about the meeting to work through the safeguarding issues and about the different options. Now, I'm doing all of this unfunded, unsupported, etc. So I actually said no. And I said, look, you're a multi-billion pound organisation. I'm an unfunded Black early career academic. I can't resolve your safeguarding issues for you. You need to invest in looking at what's safe, and you need to come back to me with an option that works and that is practical. So that's where we've left it. So, you know, I could have engaged more, and they did invite me to engage more, but I'm really at the limits of what I can do. So I chose not to take UKRI up in that invite. So they're hoping to come back to me with other options, but I'm letting them work through it to find something that's practical and safe for the women involved.
Well, what's striking in what you're saying as well is that you've actually done the process for them and created the space for them, and all they had to do was enter it. Like, you actually didn't ask them to take any specific safeguarding actions. And I think that is a great illustration of where we're at right now, that you've gone, this is what we need. I've identified this problem. Let's discuss this. Here's a safe forum for everyone invested in this conversation to have this meeting, and for them then to be like, oh, well, we can't have that meeting, it's not on our terms.
Yeah,
is exactly.
In their Black Lives Matter statement, they said they were absolutely committed to changing the systems and processes that marginalise Black voices. And what I was saying was, here is a system and process that is marginalising Black voices, that these Black women don't feel safe enough to enter into a discussion with you unless this changes. And the immediate response, before we'd even gone anywhere else, was, no, that's not normal, we can't do it. So if they can't change their system and process just to have a meeting with us, it doesn't give me a huge amount of faith that they're going to be willing to change anything else in order to create an inclusive, accountable system for research. You know, if they can't change the normal way of holding a meeting, what can they change? How far are they prepared to adapt for the sake of inclusion? To address systemic racism, discrimination, inequality in research, they need to look internally, not just externalise the issue and problem. Quite often it's seen as a lack of capacity of Black academics, as something that needs to be done in the system. What I'm saying is, you have to change yourself. You have to look inwards at your own systems and processes and power, and you have to adapt if you are serious about creating change. And I think that's where we've got at the moment. I hope things will change in the future. I'm still really keen to work with UKRI, but I'm nervous and I'm anxious about the whole process.
I just want to I'm aware that we've just hit 8 o'clock, so I just want to draw attention to that. But I also wanted to acknowledge a couple of points that have been made in the chat about solutions that really pick up on what you've just said, and about this idea of internal change and internal reflection. And actually, we've had a lot of questions about allyship and how people as white academics or members of publishing industries or so on can interrupt this process. And I think that actually what you've just done in a beautifully powerful and concise way is explain this issue of sort of sitting and complacency and allowing these things to continue. So 2 examples we've had of solutions put up in the chat was to, on a day-to-day basis, notice how your Black colleagues are treated, and where there are people being dismissed or similar ideas, to actually stop and return the conversation to that individual, naming them and recentering their idea as theirs, so that the diffusion of knowledge, which happens so frequently. I mean, happened to me only today. I wrote an entire proposal, sent it in with my colleague CC'd, and 3 white men wrote back to him telling him how great it was, and they were so grateful that he'd come up with this concept. It had nothing to do with him. He just happens to be the head of that area. And this happens to us all the time. And it is that he didn't write back, I wrote back, and he should have written back. And it's those are sort of simple examples. We also had examining who sits on panels, which goes all the way back in some ways to the beginning of the conversation, where we're having conversations about decolonization and interrupting where research money goes, and thinking about who is in the process of these observations, and where you don't have good fit colleagues, or you don't have a diverse representation, to actually look outside of your specific zone to find people who may have pertinent experience. Because again, one of the things we've got to do is look at new models rather than going, well, we have to make sure we adhere to the format we have. Well, if your format you have doesn't work, we have to break it. And I think that's exactly what you said. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to suggest that we sort of pop round. That sounds very informal, but sort of go round through each person, perhaps coming to Jason first, just with anything, perhaps one key thing you think we could all be doing in this moment, or we should be thinking about doing, perhaps, to take this conversation forward.
So in terms of kind of, I guess, thinking, just kind of two main points. I think, to be honest with you, in many respects, we're many of the people here are part of the collective. They're part of the people that want to change. So really, the call to arms should be towards, I guess, UKRI. And I think a big part of what they need to do is modernise in terms of funding criteria. What they do needs to be reflective of, an ever-changing academy, and the fact that it needs to embrace this idea that actually, the academy doesn't work within a microcosm. It's not just a beacon, nor should it be a beacon or a reflection of white excellence. It should be a reflection of all excellence, including Black excellence, which is often trivialized and marginalized towards specific things. And I think that's really, really important. And I think there's a festivization around Black academics as being kind of strange, or, they often all do the same thing. And I think it's very similar to like the David Bowie song in Changes, kind of, I think it's really important for UKRI to embrace the strange. I think if we are so strange and so different, then they need to embrace that actually by their exclusive actions. They're actually marginalizing a whole generation of tremendously gifted academics that could add and contribute to scholarly endeavor, contributions to knowledge in a way, again, that benefits our collective multicultural society. And I think it's so important that we have those voices. So I think if I was going to say a take-home message to UKRI, it'd be to embrace the strange, because I think, people of colour are pretty good at what they do. If they're given a chance to show what they can do, I think the academy will be a better reflection and a better academy.
I think there's something about the filtering system and the brains that are coming up with these calls, which are unimaginative. There needs to be co-creation in the process. I'm aware that, UKRI puts out a call within the institution. There's a filtering process of who gets to apply. The labour that's on you to be able to build up the courage to even put yourself forward against your white colleagues to apply for the same thing, it's dangerous. Seriously, it's dangerous. And so there are other strategies that we come up with that actually they do work. I found people who've gone out of their way to say, Erinma, you gave a keynote talk on blah, 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 blah. What came out of that keynote? Keynote's meant to turn into funding, right? It had never happened to me, but there was one academic who actually turned up to an event that I was putting on and said, you weren't in a meeting where they gathered all the experts in the field on citizen science. You weren't there. You gave the keynote. You were doing it as participatory research before anyone called it citizen science. You weren't there. I want you to be on my project. There are people that can be bothered to do that. We need more people like that to make space for Black academics, enable us to be in a position to lead, recognise actually how easy we have to move all the time. And, I'm becoming a nomad. I don't even know which institution I'm actually at the moment, but, but my ORCID ID moves with me. Why can't that just be an easy way to move? Take my funding. You don't like what I'm doing. Okay, I can move. Not a problem. Let's do the nomad thing. Higher education is about to enter as if it's going to be the footballing. We're in uber accelerated neoliberal times. There's going to be like a horse race and a football race, from now on, with academics who are going to be picked and taken from one institution to another. We're going to be working across what Black academics have experienced for the last 20 years. White folks are going to be experiencing that too. That's where we are with the precarious nature of the academy right now. And you know what? Our younger people, they're not interested. They want to work directly in the communities, absolutely. Whether they're studying science or they're studying some other subject, they want to work in organisations to make change now. They can't wait. Climate crisis, mental health, systemic racism, come on, construction of whiteness, it's not going to save anybody. Let's flip it.
Let's flip it. 100%. We've had make sure that your funding and other application processes are flexible and embrace who we are, not who you want us to be. We've got the idea of making an ORCID ID or something equivalent part of a way of determining an academic value, rather than this concept of sort of stability, this sort of idea of embracing nomadic life and flexibility, and the recognition that precariousness is not indicative of a lack of value, but a lack of actually a form of adaptability and a lack of space for you within the system as it exists. So I'm going to pass on to Arun now.
Thanks. I mean, it's hard to say more than what's already been said. I think the only thing I can really contribute is that this is one moment of many to come. And in a sad way, we know that racism will continue. But what we have seen is that when there's been a huge global movement backing it, people are starting to listen up a little bit and starting to grab their attention. And we've seen already that moments, so even these kind of these global movements create moments that can help smaller groups or smaller ethnic minority groups and Black community groups to create some momentum for even just a little bit of change in their society. So I think as long as we can keep trying to create more moments, keep trying to draw on the inspiration of peers of colour across the world that are experiencing and are creating strength through pain or from pain, I think that's something that we could really learn from, and we should always continue to call it out and keep calling it out as much as possible. But yeah, no, there's not really much more I could contribute after such thoughtful and diligent responses so far. So yeah.
I just want to bounce on two more things, and then I'm going to hand over to Addy to wrap up this session. As I realise we're coming close to time, there are just two things I wanted to flag that we haven't really discussed, which is the culture of benevolence, the idea of gifting to academics of colour as some sort of benefactorial, privileged exchange of power for a moment of representation. And that has become a very common part of the dialogue in trying to deal with EDI issues, and particularly to do with research funding and the makeup of committees. Oh, I met you once at a conference and I know your Black heritage, so I'm going to shoehorn you into this role so we have someone and you feel valued. That's not what we're looking for. And if you find yourself caught up in that process, actually stopping and evaluating that and making sure that you are actually valuing our research and our labour. But also something, this is more challenging perhaps, that I think we haven't really grappled with perhaps, is that many of the people, particularly the women who are not represented here today, don't have any choice in some way but to speak out, because nothing improves for them or us if we don't speak out. And there's been quite a lot of conversation about what about the risk to my position? Well, for many people in this position, in these conversations, we're already at risk. Like, we will be the first person out of the door, we will be fired, we will not be employed again. And actually recognizing that being able to decide whether it's safe for you to do something or not is in fact in academia, unfortunately, a form of privilege. It's really hard, it's a really challenging truth, but it is actually something that we need to sit with and look at. Thank you so much for everyone's questions and comments. I'm going to pass over to Addy now to wrap up.
Okay, thank you. It's been really, it has been an experience for me doing today. I think as Hannah highlighted, actually not questioning yourself in this type of space is a privilege. And I think maybe as I started this conversation, I was questioning myself and getting nervous, etc. But this is an intimidating thing to do, and this is an intimidating space when you are an outsider and when you feel like you're an outsider. And I think as this conversation's gone on, I've calmed down and relaxed and joined the conversation, and I'm reminding myself that when we're addressing issues like inequality, like COVID, which we understand is related to differences of identity, when we're addressing racial tensions and Black Lives Matter, we're not starting from zero. There is so much knowledge and wealth of expertise out there. There are so many individuals with something to contribute, like Dr. Michelle King-Okoye, who's actually, regardless of not getting funding, she's going on and doing her research regardless. There are so many Black female academics who have left academia. There's a whole history and intergenerational process, so much learning that's happened over time. We're not starting from zero, and we shouldn't act like we do. For myself and for many other individuals, the line between academia and community work is blurred. And I think that speaks to something Erinma says, that actually I believe that action should be informed by knowledge, but also knowledge should be informed by action. There's a huge potential here for us to utilize knowledge to create change and actually to address the most complex of problems. And we're not utilizing what we have. We need to stop panicking. We need to stop acting like we're starting from ground zero and these things haven't been considered before. But we also need to not fall into false complacency. The solutions that have been talked about before, they're not fit for this time. They need to be adapted and developed. And we need to be working with communities, with younger people coming through the system to respond to the environment and the context that we have now. Organisations like UKRI have to change and adapt if we're to address the issues that we're facing. So I think on that kind of final point, I'm going to invite everybody to I'll send out a survey shortly with where you can add in your comments, thoughts and reflections and feedback on this event. So you'll have that opportunity. But what I don't want it to be is just a talking shop for just one day. We have to go forward and actually co-create something that works for this time, utilising the expertise within the Black community, utilising the knowledge that's already been gathered, and working in solidarity and partnership with individuals of different identities. So this isn't just about Black academics. This is about disabled individuals, working class individuals, LGBTQ individuals, white individuals. Everybody should be invested in co-creating something that's better, that's more inclusive and accountable for us to go forward. And I need all of your help in this. So I just wanted to thank everybody that's taken part in this panel today, for everybody that joined and donated towards this work and for me going on. I'll keep you posted on what happens. You can follow me on Twitter or look at my website, laddersforaction.org or knowledgeispower.live. And you keep updated on what's happening, because we're not going to stop here. And this is just the start of action. So I'm calling out to everybody, please join me, please work with us together so we can all move forward and create something different for the challenges that we're facing. And I think with that, I'll say goodnight and thank you very much.
Addy, just to say thank you to you, and for others who are in a position to donate, I would recommend if you're on a full salary and you can afford it, please donate to the work that Addy has done. I would recommend 300 quid if you're fully tenured. If you're in a position to put something forward, every penny counts. Imagine the work that she's already done. Let's keep this going. This is not for profit, right? But
yeah,
this costs money. So please, if you have the pennies, please donate.
Thank you very much.